The tin cup was filled with snow. It was the only meal she could give them. The little girl whimpered first, a sound so small the wind almost stole it. Her brother, a boy no older than 9, didn't even look up. He just kept his eyes on the hollowed stump where their mother knelt, her hands red and cracked from the cold. She scooped another handful of white powder into the cup, her fingers shaking so badly she could barely press the lid back on. She handed it to her son like it was a bowl of hot stew. "Hold it close," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Let it melt slow." The boy, Calb, did as he was told. He was thin as a fence rail, his face smudged with dirt and worry, but his hands were steady. His sister Anna, maybe 6 years old, crawled into her mother's lap, her tiny body racked with shivers. Calb held the cup to Anna's chapped lips, letting a single, freezing drop touch her tongue. They shared the melting snow between them, sip for agonizing sip. Their mother didn't drink. Her own lips were already turning a deep, terrifying shade of purple. Her breaths were shallow, little puffs of white in the frigid air. No one used this trail in the dead of winter. It was a ghost road, swallowed by the forest. But still, the mother, Miriam, kept looking up, her eyes scanning the suffocating whiteness of the trees. She was looking for a miracle, for a ghost of her own to appear and save them. She'd stopped praying out loud 2 days ago, but her lips still moved, forming silent, desperate words against the biting wind. She didn't know that miles away, a man was riding toward them. His name was Eli Grant, and he was a ghost of a different sort. His horse was old, but its steps were sure on the hard-packed snow. Eli's coat was stitched and restitched, a map of long, lonely years spent under a harsh sun. He didn't talk much anymore, not to people, and certainly not to God. He figured God had stopped listening the day the doctor told him his wife, Catherine, would never bear children. That was 6 winters ago. He'd buried her behind the cottonwood tree 2 winters after that. Now, the silence in his cabin was so loud, it was like a constant scream. He rode the fence lines out of habit, not expectation. His life was a series of empty chores meant to fill empty days. Solitude was his only companion. So when his horse suddenly stopped, blowing a sharp, nervous breath, Eli pulled the reins tight. He listened. At first, there was nothing but the wind sighing through the pines. Then he heard it. A cough. A tiny, hacking sound, followed by what sounded like a child's cry. He dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively going to the rifle strapped to his back. He moved through the brush, his boots sinking into a deep drift, and then he saw them. A woman, slumped against the trunk of a great oak, with 2 small children huddled against her. They looked like statues carved from ice and despair. The boy, Calb, saw him first. He scrambled to his feet, trying to block Eli's view of his mother and sister. He tried to look tough, but his knees were wobbling from cold and starvation. He was a sapling trying to stand against a hurricane. Eli didn't speak. He just knelt in the snow, pulling off his thick leather gloves so they could see his hands were empty. He was not a threat. Not today. The woman's eyes fluttered open. They were glazed over, unfocused. He wasn't even sure she could see him. "How long you been out here?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. The boy's voice was a cracked whisper. 2 days. Maybe 3. "Where's your wagon?" "Gone," the boy whispered. "Axle broke. Mama walked us." Eli looked back at the trail. The snow had buried any tracks long ago. They were ghosts out here, and the world had already forgotten them. He looked at the little girl, Anna, curled in her mother's lap, too cold to even shiver anymore. Her silence was more terrifying than any scream. He didn't make speeches. He didn't offer empty comforts. He just acted. He slid his arms under the woman and lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of rags and bones. "Bring your sister," he told the boy. Calb hesitated for just a second, his eyes wide with a fear that was older than he was. Then he nodded, scooping his sister into his arms. Eli whistled for his horse and carried Miriam back to the trail. Calb followed, staggering under Anna's weight. By the time they reached Eli's cabin, his beard was crusted with frozen breath and falling snow. He kicked the door open with his boot heel. The cabin was cold and dark, smelling of pine smoke and loneliness. He carried the woman straight to the bed in the corner, his bed, the one he hadn't shared since Catherine died, and laid her down gently. Then he moved with a speed that defied his years. He built a fire in the hearth, so hot the stone walls began to sweat. He put a kettle of water on the stove. He found blankets, thick wool ones that smelled of cedar. Kalb had placed his sister on a wooden chair by the growing fire. He was already stripping off her wet, frozen coat, rubbing her tiny hands between his own. Eli watched the boy for a moment. He saw a man's resolve in a child's body. Eli knelt and carefully peeled back Miriam's worn boots. He grimaced at the sight of her feet. They were swollen and blue at the toes. Frostbite had already laid its claim. She needed warmth. She needed food. But most of all, she needed to live. She finally stirred near midnight. The fire was a roaring comfort, and the cabin was filled with the smell of simmering broth. Her eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus on the unfamiliar ceiling. "Where?" Her voice was like sandpaper. "You're safe," Eli said from his chair by the fire. "Kids are warm. Don't move." "Who?" "Eli Grant." She swallowed, a painful, difficult motion. "My children." He nodded toward the hearth. "The boy's name is Kalb. The girl is Anna." He'd learned their names from the boy's quiet, watchful whispers. She closed her eyes again, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. Kalb sat in a chair, watching Eli like a hawk. He hadn't let go of Anna since they'd arrived. He held her sleeping form on his lap, his small arm draped protectively over her. "You're not going to send us away, are you?" Kalb asked, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Eli didn't answer right away. He added another log to the flames, the orange light flickering across his weathered face. He looked at this strange, broken family that had washed up on the shore of his solitude. Finally, he spoke. "No. You stay as long as you need." Kalb didn't say thank you. He just looked down at his sister and nodded once, as if confirming a treaty. That night, Eli sat in his chair with the rifle across his lap. He didn't sleep. He hadn't let another living soul under his roof in 6 years. Now, 3 strangers were breathing his air, sleeping in his warmth. And for the first time in a long, long time, he didn't feel invaded. He felt something else, a weight, a purpose. But as he stared into the dying embers of the fire, a cold dread settled in his gut. This woman and her children weren't just running from a broken wagon and a bad winter. They were running from something else, something far, far worse. And he had just invited it to his door. The storm broke with the dawn. The world outside was still blanketed in white, but a sliver of blue sky appeared on the horizon like a fresh bruise. Miriam woke up for real this time. She sat up slowly, wincing as pain shot through her frostbitten feet. Her eyes darted around the room, frantic and wild, until they landed on her children. Kalb and Anna were asleep near the hearth, wrapped in thick wool blankets. They looked peaceful, safe, a sight she hadn't seen in months. Only then did her gaze fall on Eli, who was sitting in his chair, nursing a cup of coffee and watching her. "You saved us," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Did what I could. My name is Miriam." "The boy told me." She looked down at her hands, which were still raw and chapped. "I didn't mean to trespass on your land." "You didn't trespass," he said gruffly. "You collapsed." He paused. "You got somewhere to go?" Her eyes welled up, but she blinked the tears back with a ferocity that surprised him. "My husband. He died last spring. Fever took him. We have no other family. I was heading west. I heard there were jobs, a place for a widow to work." "There are no jobs worth walking through that snow for," Eli said, his tone flat. "I didn't think we'd make it," she admitted, her voice trembling. Eli stood up, the moment of vulnerability making him restless. He ladled some of the warm broth into a bowl and offered it to her. She took it with shaking hands and ate slowly, each spoonful bringing a little more color back to her face. For the next few days, a strange, fragile peace settled over the cabin. Calb, seeing that Eli was not a threat, began to follow him around the ranch like a shadow. He didn't talk much, but he watched everything, his young mind soaking up the rhythms of the land. Anna, still wary, stayed close to her mother, but a small laugh escaped her lips when she watched Eli try to fix a crooked shutter and drop the hammer on his own foot. That sound, the laughter of a child, was so foreign in the silent cabin that it felt like a gunshot. It echoed off the walls, startling the ghosts that had lived there for so long. Miriam, for her part, began to heal. She moved with a quiet purpose, sweeping the floors, mending the children's clothes, boiling water. She never overstepped, never pried into the quiet corners of Eli's life. She simply filled the empty spaces with a gentle, humming presence. Then one afternoon, Eli came in from chopping wood to find the table set for 4. Not just with plates, but with a clean, ironed tablecloth. It was Catherine's. He hadn't seen it in years. A candle sat in the middle. Calb was grinning. Anna was clapping her hands. Miriam turned from the stove, a faint blush on her cheeks. "It's not much," she said, her voice soft. "But I thought we could share a meal, proper-like." Eli sat down. The stew was the same as it had been every night, but somehow it tasted different, warmer, like something inside the cold stone walls of the cabin, and inside him, was finally starting to thaw. Later that night, long after the children were asleep, a sharp, angry knock echoed from the front door. Eli was on his feet in an instant, the rifle he'd set back on the mantel now heavy in his hands. Miriam instinctively pulled the blankets tighter around Anna, while Calb, ever the little soldier, moved to stand in front of them. Eli opened the door a crack. A man stood on the porch, leaning heavily against the frame, a half-empty bottle dangling from his hand. He had a cruel sneer on his face. Eli recognized him. Jed, a drunk from the nearest town who always had too much to say. "Thought this was Grant land?" Jed slurred, his eyes fixing on Miriam in the firelight. "It is," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "Then you won't mind me asking what a pretty widow like Miriam Hoover is doing living under your roof?" Eli's hand tightened on the rifle. "You need to leave." Jed chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "Funny, you don't seem too concerned what folks'll think. A good Christian man like you, taking in a woman, with children that ain't yours." He spat on the porch. "Looks suspicious, Grant. Real suspicious. I said leave," Eli repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Before he could say more, Calb stepped forward, his small fists clenched. "You don't get to talk about my mama like that." Jed raised a mocking eyebrow. "Well, now look at that. The little pup's got teeth." That was enough. Eli stepped fully onto the porch, his large frame blocking Jed's view of the family inside. He moved with a deliberate, lethal calm. "You've had your say. Now get off my land before I help you find the bottom of that ridge." Jed's drunken smile faltered. He saw something in Eli's eyes that sobered him up fast, something cold and ancient and unforgiving. He stumbled backward. "You'll regret this, Grant. She ain't worth the trouble she's bringing." The cabin door slammed shut before he could finish. Inside, the fire crackled, but the warmth had fled. The silence was back, sharp and heavy. Eli turned to Miriam. Her face was pale, her arms wrapped tightly around her children. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded slowly, her eyes wide. "I know him. From town. After my husband passed, he offered to take us in. When I refused, he told me I'd regret it." Eli looked out the window, at the long, dark shadows stretching across the snow. The world outside suddenly seemed closer, more menacing. Jed wasn't just a drunk, he was a harbinger, a sign that whatever Miriam was running from was catching up. "Not here," Eli said, his voice a raw promise. Not ever again. But as he looked at her terrified face, he knew it was a lie. Trouble didn't care about property lines, and this family hadn't just brought life into his home. They had brought a war, and it was already on his doorstep. Jed's visit left a stain on the fragile peace of the cabin. The air grew thick with unspoken questions. Eli started carrying his rifle with him when he did his chores, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Miriam grew quieter, her smiles becoming rare and fleeting. She jumped at every unexpected noise, a branch snapping, the wind howling a little too loudly. Fear was a poison, and it was slowly seeping back into her veins. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she finally spoke the words that had been haunting the space between them. "He's not the one I'm afraid of." Eli looked up from the piece of wood he was carving. He didn't ask. He just waited. "My husband Daniel, he was a good man," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "But he borrowed money to get our farm started, from the wrong man, a man named Tom." Her hands twisted in her lap. "When the fever took Daniel, Tom came to collect. We had nothing left, no money, no crop. So he made me another offer." She shuddered, pulling her shawl tighter. "He said I could work off the debt, in his house. He said he'd take care of me and the children." Eli's hands stopped moving. The knife grew still. He knew what kind of man took care of a desperate widow. "I said no," Miriam continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I packed what little we had in the night and I ran. I thought if I could get far enough west, he'd forget about us." "Men like that don't forget," Eli said, his voice flat. He knew all too well. "Jed, he works for Tom sometimes. Odd jobs. He must have sent word that he found me." She looked at Eli, her eyes pleading. "You need to let us go. We'll leave in the morning. We can't bring this down on you." "It's too late for that," Eli said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "It was too late the moment I brought you in from the snow." He stood up and walked to the small, dusty shelf where Catherine's things remained untouched. He picked up a small, framed photograph. It was of him and his wife, younger, smiling. He turned back to Miriam. 6 years ago, I lost everything I ever cared about. This house, this land. It hasn't been a home since. It's been a tomb." He set the photograph down. "You and those children. You brought life back into these walls. I had forgotten what that felt like." He looked her straight in the eye. "I'm not letting that go without a fight." A week passed in tense silence. Every dawn felt like a reprieve, every sunset a threat. Then, one afternoon, a rider appeared at the edge of the property. He wasn't drunk like Jed. This man was cold, sober, and professional. He had a long, jagged scar running down his cheek, and his eyes were as empty as a winter sky. He didn't come to the porch. He just sat on his horse by the fence, a silent sentinel. Eli went out to meet him, unarmed. "Eli Grant," the man said. It wasn't a question. "What's your business?" Eli asked. "I have a message from Mr. Tom," the man said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "He understands you're providing shelter for some misplaced property. He's a reasonable man. He's willing to forgive your indiscretion. Just send the woman and her children back down the mountain. No one has to get hurt." "This is my land," Eli said, his voice steady, "and the people on it are under my protection." The scar-faced man smiled, a humorless twitch of his lips. "That's a noble sentiment, Mr. Grant, but protection is an expensive thing, and Mr. Tom always collects his debts." He gestured vaguely toward the cabin. "He says to remind you, some debts come with interest, and interest doesn't care whose roof she's under." He turned his horse. "You have 2 days." The man rode off, leaving a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. Eli walked back to the cabin, his face a grim mask. Miriam met him at the door. "What did he want?" "He wants you," Eli said simply. Tears finally spilled down her cheeks. "I can't let you get hurt because of us. It's my debt, my mistake." Eli's expression softened for a moment. He looked past her at Calb and Anna playing by the fire. "It stopped being just your fight the minute he threatened my home." He paused, and a shadow passed over his face, a memory from a life he'd tried to bury. "You don't know what men like him will do." "And you do?" she asked, catching the darkness in his tone. He looked away, toward the setting sun. "I know men like that," he said, his voice low and full of a terrible ancient pain. "Because a long time ago, I used to be one." The confession hung in the air between them, more shocking than any threat. Miriam stared at him, seeing not just a lonely rancher, but a man with a past as haunted as her own. He wasn't just a savior. He was a man looking for redemption. And Tom, the faceless monster from her past, wasn't just coming for her. He was coming for a piece of Eli's soul. The 2 days passed like a death sentence. The air in the cabin grew thin, each breath a conscious effort. Eli didn't elaborate on his past, and Miriam didn't ask. The confession sat between them, a shared, unspoken secret that bound them together more tightly than any promise. He wasn't the simple, grieving rancher she'd thought he was. He was something more complex, something more dangerous. She saw it in the way he moved now, not like a farmer, but like a predator. He checked the sight on his rifle, cleaned the barrel with a meticulous, practiced calm. He walked the perimeter of his property, not just looking for tracks, but studying the angles, the cover, the lines of fire. He was preparing for a war he knew how to fight. Miriam did her part. She stockpiled food and water in the small root cellar beneath the floorboards. She taught Calb and Anna how to be silent, how to hide. She showed them the secret crawlspace behind the hearth, a dark, dusty hole that smelled of old earth. "If anything happens," she whispered, her voice tight with a fear she tried to hide, "you hide here. You don't make a sound. Not until I or Mr. Grant come for you. Do you understand?" Calb nodded solemnly, his young face set with a grim determination. Anna just clung to her mother's leg, her eyes wide with terror. The second night, as darkness fell like a shroud over the mountains, Eli took a second rifle from a locked chest under his bed. It was newer, sleeker, a weapon he hadn't touched in years. He handed it to Miriam. "Do you know how to use one of these?" he asked. She shook her head, her hands trembling as she took the heavy weapon. He showed her how to load it, how to aim, how to brace it against her shoulder. His hands were steady as he guided hers, his voice a low, patient murmur in the flickering lamplight. He was teaching her how to kill. And as she looked into his eyes, she saw the ghost of the man he used to be, a man who knew death intimately. "They'll come before dawn," he said, his voice flat. "That's his way. He likes the dark." "How do you know?" she whispered. "Because that's how I would do it," he said, without a trace of emotion. They didn't sleep. They waited. Eli sat by the main window, his rifle across his knees, a silhouette against the dying fire. Miriam sat in a chair across the room, her own rifle feeling alien and heavy in her lap. The children were already hidden in the crawlspace, clutching each other in the dark. The silence was absolute. Not a single cricket chirped. Not a single gust of wind rattled the shutters. It was the silence of a world holding its breath. Then they came, not with a thunder of hooves, but like smoke, shadows detaching from the deeper shadows of the tree line. Eli saw them first, 3 figures moving on foot, low and fast. "They're here," he said, his voice calm. "Get to the back window. Don't fire unless they breach the cabin. Aim for the center." Miriam's heart hammered against her ribs, but she did as she was told. She moved to the small window in the bedroom, her hands slick with sweat on the cold steel of the rifle. A single shot cracked through the night. It wasn't from Eli. It came from outside. The bullet shattered the window next to Eli's head, spraying glass across the floor. They weren't waiting. They were attacking. The night exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from 3 different directions, chewing through the log walls of the cabin, thudding into the heavy wooden door. Eli returned fire, not with panic, but with a cold, calculated precision. He moved from window to window, a phantom in his own home, never staying in one place for more than a second. A scream from the darkness told him one of his shots had found its mark. Miriam pressed herself against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The noise was deafening, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. She could hear them moving outside, shouting to each other. Then, she heard a new sound, a scraping at the back of the cabin, a boot finding purchase on the woodpile stacked against the wall. Someone was trying to get on the roof. Her blood ran cold, but then, a different kind of feeling surged through her. A white, hot rage. They were not going to get to her children. She remembered Eli's words. Aim for the center. She pushed the rifle through the broken pane of the back window, her fear replaced by a primal, protective fury. A dark shape appeared at the edge of the roofline, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. She didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the recoil jarring her to the bone. A choked cry, a sickening thud, as a body slid off the roof and hit the frozen ground below. She had done it. She had shot a man. She felt nothing. No remorse, no horror. Just a cold, empty satisfaction. The firing outside intensified, more frantic now, more angry. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected the widow to fight back. Suddenly a heavy thud slammed against the front door, then another. They were using a battering ram. The thick wood groaned, the iron hinges shrieking in protest. "Miriam!" Eli shouted over the din. "Get back from the door! They're coming in!" The door splintered, then burst open. Two men poured into the cabin, their faces twisted with rage in the firelight. Eli was ready. He fired from the shadows near the hearth, dropping the first man before he could even raise his pistol. The second man dove for cover behind the overturned table, firing blindly into the room. But as Eli moved to get a clear shot, a third figure emerged from the smoke-filled doorway. It was the man with the scar. And he wasn't looking at Eli. He was looking straight at Miriam. He smiled, that same cold, humorless smile. "Tom sends his regards," he said, and raised his pistol. Time seemed to slow down. Miriam saw the flash from the barrel, heard the deafening roar. She braced for the impact, for the searing pain. But it never came. Eli had thrown himself in front of her. He let out a sharp, guttural cry and crumpled to the floor. The scar-faced man laughed, a triumphant, ugly sound. He turned his pistol back toward Miriam. "Now," he said, "you and me are going for a ride." But as he took a step toward her, his eyes widened in shock. He looked down. A small, dark stain was spreading across the front of his shirt. He touched it with his fingers, then looked at them, confused by the wet, sticky warmth. Behind him, standing in the ruined doorway, was Kalb. He was holding Miriam's heavy rifle, the stock dragging on the floor. His face was streaked with tears, but his eyes were filled with a cold, adult fury. The scar-faced man staggered, his pistol falling from his grasp. He looked at the small boy who had shot him, a look of disbelief on his face. Then, he pitched forward and lay still. A sudden deafening silence fell over the cabin. It was over. Miriam rushed to Eli's side. He was clutching his shoulder, his face pale and beaded with sweat. "Eli," she sobbed, tearing a strip from her dress to press against the wound. He looked past her, at Kalb, who was still standing frozen in the doorway, the heavy rifle shaking in his small hands. "Good shot, son," Eli whispered, and then his eyes rolled back in his head. Miriam looked from the unconscious man who had saved her, to the bleeding bodies on her floor, to her own son, who had just been forced to kill. They had won, they had survived. But as she looked at the wreckage of the cabin and the terrible new knowledge in her son's eyes, she knew the war was far from over. Tom had sent his men. They had failed. Now, he would come himself. The aftermath was a waking nightmare. The cabin, once a sanctuary, was now a tomb. It smelled of blood, gunpowder, and death. Miriam, moving as if in a trance, dragged the bodies of the dead men out onto the porch, one by one, leaving them for the cold and the animals. She couldn't stand the thought of them being inside, near her children. Kalb was in shock. He had dropped the rifle and retreated into himself, sitting by the hearth, rocking back and forth, his eyes wide and vacant. He hadn't said a word since Eli had collapsed. Miriam pulled him and a terrified Anna from their hiding place, holding them close, whispering reassurances she didn't feel herself. Eli was alive, but barely. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, but he'd lost a lot of blood. Miriam managed to stop the bleeding and bind the wound, her hands surprisingly steady. She had seen her husband die of a fever, a slow, wasting death. This was different. This was violence, swift and brutal, and it required a different kind of strength. She spent the rest of the night watching over him, her heart aching with a terrifying mix of gratitude and dread. This man had thrown himself in front of a bullet for her, for them, a man she had known for little more than a week. As dawn broke, painting the snow-covered mountains in hues of gray and pink, Eli's eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, his gaze hazy with pain. "Calb?" he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "He's safe," Miriam said, her own voice thick with unshed tears. "You're safe." "The boy." Eli struggled to sit up, wincing in agony. "He shouldn't have had to do that." "He saved us," Miriam said fiercely. "He saved me." Eli sank back down, his face pale. "Tom won't stop," he said, the words costing him a great effort. "This was just a test. He was testing my resolve. Now he knows I won't break." "What will he do?" Miriam asked, her blood running cold. Eli's eyes met hers, and what she saw in them terrified her more than the gunfight had. It was a look of grim certainty. "He'll take away what I'm protecting, but he won't do it with guns. Not anymore. He'll be smarter. He'll use a different kind of weapon." 2 days later, the sheriff finally rode up. Sheriff Cade Monroe was a portly, slow-moving man who valued peace and quiet above all else. He looked at the bodies on the porch, the bullet-riddled walls of the cabin, and the exhausted, haunted faces of its occupants with a weary sigh. "Heard you had some trouble up here, Eli," he said, not even bothering to dismount. "You could say that," Eli said, his arm in a sling, his face drawn and tight. "This is Tom's work, isn't it?" the sheriff asked, his eyes avoiding Eli's. "That widow, she brought this with her." "She's my wife," Eli said, his voice ringing with a sudden, fierce authority. Miriam, standing in the doorway, gasped. The sheriff's eyebrows shot up. "We were married by a traveling preacher 2 days ago," Eli lied, his gaze daring the sheriff to question him. "Her name is Miriam Grant, and any trouble that comes for her comes for me. This is my land, and this is my family, and Tom has declared war on my family." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Now, Eli, you know Tom has deep pockets. He's got friends in high places. A direct war with him. It's not a war you can win." "I'm not asking you to fight it for me," Eli said, his voice cold as steel. "I'm just telling you what happened, so you can write it down in your report before you ride back to town and do nothing." The sheriff's face reddened. He finally dismounted, took a few notes, and promised to look into it. But they all knew it was an empty promise. Sheriff Monroe was afraid of Tom. Everyone was. After he left, Miriam turned to Eli, her heart pounding. "Why did you say that? That we were married?" "Because it's the only thing that might give him pause," Eli said, walking back into the cabin. "Tom preys on the weak, the isolated. A lone widow is property. But the wife of a landowner, a man who will fight back, that's a more complicated target. It gives us a shield, a fragile one, but it's something." "It was a lie," she whispered. "Was it?" he asked, turning to face her. His eyes were intense, searching. "You and your children have become the heart of this home, Miriam. I won't lose it again. I'll do whatever it takes to protect it, to protect you." Before she could answer, they heard a horse approaching. Not the slow, heavy tread of the sheriff's mount, but a fast, light canter. A young boy from town, no older than 15, rode up to the porch, his face flushed. "A message," he panted, handing Eli a folded piece of paper. "For the widow." Eli took it, his good hand clenching into a fist. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was it. This was Tom's next move. He handed the note to Miriam. Her hands shook so badly she could barely open it. She read the few scrawled words, and all the color drained from her face. She let out a small, choked sob and sank to her knees. "What is it?" Eli demanded, kneeling beside her. "Miriam, what does it say?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a new, unspeakable horror. "He has her," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Tom, he has my daughter." Eli stared at her, confused. "He has Anna? How? She's right here." Miriam shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, not Anna. My other daughter. My firstborn." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Eli could only stare, his mind reeling. "Her name is Ruth," Miriam choked out, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. I had her before I met Daniel. I was young, alone. I couldn't. They told me she died." Her voice broke. "It was a lie. They sold her. Tom's the one who bought her. The note was a ransom, but Tom didn't want money. He wanted Miriam. He would trade the daughter she thought was dead for the family she had now." Eli finally understood. Tom wasn't going to attack the cabin again. He had found a weapon far more cruel, far more effective. He was going to make Miriam choose. And it was a choice that would destroy her, no matter what she did. The revelation shattered the world. A ghost child, a secret buried so deep Miriam herself had believed it to be a grave, was now Tom's ultimate weapon, Ruth. The name was a wound. "He's had her all this time," Miriam whispered, crumpling the note in her fist. "All these years, living as his property, while I thought she was in heaven." The agony in her voice was a physical thing, a blade twisting in Eli's gut. He looked at Calb and Anna, now huddled in the doorway, their small faces etched with confusion and fear. They had just survived a siege, only to be thrown into a war of the heart. "What does he want?" Eli asked, though he already knew the answer. "A trade," she said, her voice dead. "Me for her. He says to come to the saloon in Blue Hollow, alone. If he even sees you, he says the deal is off, and I'll never see Ruth again." It was a perfect trap. Tom had isolated her completely. He was banking on a mother's love being stronger than any alliance, any rifle. "You can't go," Eli said, his voice raw. "It's a lie. He'll take you both." "I have to," she sobbed, grabbing the front of his shirt. "Eli, you don't understand. She's my daughter. She's been living in hell, and it's my fault. I have to get her out." "It's not your fault," he said fiercely, his hands gripping her shoulders. "And walking into his arms is not the answer." But he could see the resolve hardening in her eyes, the desperate, primal instinct of a mother to save her child, no matter the cost. He knew that nothing he could say would stop her. That night, the cabin was a tomb of misery. Miriam packed a small bag, her movements stiff and robotic. She held Calb and Anna, telling them she had to go away for a little while, that she loved them more than the stars in the sky. It was a goodbye, and they all knew it. Eli watched, his heart a block of ice in his chest. His wounded shoulder throbbed, a dull, constant reminder of his failure to protect them. He had offered her a shield, and Tom had simply walked around it. Before dawn, she was ready. She stood at the door, a silhouette against the pale pre-dawn light. She looked like a ghost, already gone. "Take care of them, Eli," she whispered. "Miriam, don't," he pleaded one last time. She turned and walked out the door without looking back. He watched her ride away, a lone figure disappearing into the vast, indifferent wilderness. He was left with her 2 children, a broken home, and an impossible choice. He could honor her wishes and stay put, condemning her to a fate worse than death. Or he could follow, break the deal, and risk the life of the daughter she had just found. He looked at Calb, who was trying to be brave, his small chin trembling. He looked at Anna, who was crying silently into her hands, and he knew there was no choice at all. He had told Miriam he used to be a bad man. It was time for that man to come back. He turned to Kalb. "Son, I need you to be the man of the house for a little while. Can you do that?" Kalb wiped his eyes and nodded, straightening his small shoulders. "Yes, sir. Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me or the sheriff. You understand?" "Yes, sir." Eli saddled his own horse. He didn't take a rifle. Tom's men would be watching the trails for that. Instead, he slipped a long, wicked-looking knife into his boot and a small, easily concealed pistol into the waistband of his pants. He was done playing defense. He was going hunting. He rode hard, not on the main trail to Blue Hollow, but through the dense, unforgiving backcountry he knew like the back of his hand. He was no longer a rancher. He was the man he used to be, an enforcer, a shadow, a man who understood the currency of violence. He rode to the one place he knew he could find help. He rode to Sheriff Cade Monroe's house. He didn't knock. He kicked the door in. The sheriff was sitting at his table having breakfast. He jumped to his feet, his face a mixture of shock and anger. "Grant, what in God's name?" "Get your gun, Cade," Eli said, his voice deadly calm. "We're going to Blue Hollow." "Now you listen here," the sheriff blustered. "I told you, I'm not getting into a war with Tom." Eli stepped forward, his eyes boring into the sheriff. "You remember that business down in Laredo, 10 years ago? The one involving the cattle baron's son and the card game?" The color drained from the sheriff's face. That was a long time ago." "Funny how some things never get old," Eli said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I was there, Cade. I saw what you did. I'm the only one left who knows the whole story. I kept my mouth shut then. I won't, now." It was blackmail, pure and simple. "You're either going to be the man who helps me save a woman and a child from a monster, or you're going to be the man who hangs for murder. Your choice." The sheriff stared at him, his jowls trembling. He saw that Eli wasn't bluffing. The quiet, grieving rancher was gone. This was a man with nothing left to lose. Slowly, Cade Monroe reached for his gun belt. "What's the plan?" Blue Hollow was a wretched hive of a town, run by Tom and his thugs. The saloon was his fortress. Eli and the sheriff rode in not as lawmen, but as ghosts, circling around the back, using the alleyways for cover. Eli saw Miriam's horse tied up outside the saloon. He knew she was inside. "You create a distraction at the front," Eli told Cade. "Fire some shots, make a scene, I'm going in the back." "This is suicide, Eli." "Probably," Eli said, and slipped into the shadows. He moved silently along the back wall of the saloon, his knife in his hand. He found a rear window grimy and cracked. He peered inside. The main room was a chaotic scene. Cade was doing his job, his shots sending the saloon's patrons diving for cover. In the midst of the panic, Eli saw them. Tom was a large, well-dressed man with a cruel, smiling mouth. He had one hand on Miriam's arm, holding her tight, and with his other arm, he held a small, terrified girl in front of him like a shield. Ruth. She was thin and pale, her eyes wide with a terror that looked ancient. Tom was laughing, enjoying the chaos. He leaned down and whispered something in Miriam's ear. She flinched, her face a mask of pure hatred. Eli's blood boiled. He wasn't going to let this monster win. He kicked in the back door with all his strength. The door flew off its hinges, crashing into a stack of barrels. For a second, everyone froze, turning to see the new source of chaos. Eli stepped into the room, the small pistol now in his hand. He wasn't aiming at Tom. He was aiming at the ornate crystal chandelier hanging directly above him. He fired once. The chandelier exploded in a shower of glass and metal, crashing down onto the table where Tom's guards were taking cover. In that single moment of confusion, Eli lunged. He didn't go for Tom. He went for Miriam. "Get Ruth!" he screamed, shoving her toward the girl. Miriam didn't hesitate. She snatched her daughter, pulling her away from Tom's grasp. Tom, enraged, turned to face Eli, drawing his own pistol. "You!" he roared. "You were supposed to stay away!" "Plans change," Eli said, his knife now flashing in his hand. He closed the distance between them, a blur of motion. Tom fired, but his shot went wide. Eli slammed into him, driving the bigger man backward. They crashed over a table, a whirlwind of desperate, brutal violence. This wasn't a duel, it was a brawl. Eli used his fists, his boots, the knife. He was fighting with the pent-up rage of a decade of grief and loneliness. He was fighting for the family he'd never thought he'd have. He was fighting for his own soul. He felt a searing pain in his side as Tom buried a knife of his own into his ribs, but Eli barely registered it. He drove his own blade home, again and again, until Tom's struggles ceased. Eli staggered to his feet, breathing heavily, covered in blood, some of it his, some of it Tom's. He looked across the ruined saloon. Sheriff Cade had arrested the remaining guards. The patrons were staring in stunned silence. And in the corner, Miriam was holding Ruth, sobbing and stroking her hair. The little girl was clinging to her, her face buried in her mother's shoulder, finally safe. Eli walked toward them, stumbling slightly. He knelt in front of them, ignoring the screaming pain in his side. He looked at Miriam, then at the small, trembling girl in her arms. "Let's go home," he said. They rode out of Blue Hollow as the sun began to set, leaving the darkness and the violence behind them. They were a strange, broken, bloody, and beautiful family. Eli was wounded, perhaps mortally. Miriam's heart was shattered and rebuilt. Ruth was a ghost returned to the living. But as they crested the ridge and saw the small, welcoming light of the cabin shining in the distance, they knew they had won more than just a fight. They had won a future. The healing was slow, slower than the spring thaw, more painful than setting a broken bone. Eli's wound in his side was deep, and for days, he hovered between life and death, his fevered dreams filled with the ghosts of his violent past. Miriam never left his side. She cleaned the wound, forced broth between his cracked lips, and prayed with a fervor she hadn't felt since she'd knelt in the snow, begging God for a miracle. He had given her one then. She was asking for another now. The children were the quiet heart of the broken home. Calb, having seen too much, became Eli's silent guard, sitting by his bed for hours, his small hand resting on the man's uninjured arm. Anna, sensing the shift in the world, brought Eli wildflowers she picked from the meadow, placing them in a jar by his bed. And Ruth was a phantom. She drifted through the cabin like a whisper, her eyes taking in everything, saying nothing. She watched Miriam tend to Eli's wounds with a wary, unreadable expression. She had been raised in a world where kindness was a trick, and love was a cage. She didn't know how to accept this new reality. One afternoon, as Miriam was changing the dressing on Eli's wound, Ruth spoke for the first time. Her voice was small, rusty from disuse. "Why are you helping him?" Miriam looked up, surprised. "He's a good man, sweetheart. He saved us." "Men aren't good," Ruth stated, her voice flat, repeating a lesson she had been taught for a decade. "They just want things." Miriam's heart broke. She left Eli's side and knelt in front of the small, broken girl who was her daughter. "Some men are like that," she said softly. "But not all of them. This man gave us a home when we had nothing. He fought for us when no one else would. He loves us." Ruth just stared at her, her child's face a mask of adult cynicism. Weeks turned into a month. Eli's fever broke. The color returned to his face. He began to sit up, then to walk, leaning heavily on a cane Calb had carved for him. The ranch, neglected during the turmoil, began to come back to life under their collective care. They worked together, a strange patchwork family stitched together by trauma and hope. Calb helped Eli mend the fences, his youthful energy a balm to Eli's weariness. Miriam and Anna started a small garden, their laughter echoing in the spring air. Ruth remained apart, an observer. But slowly, tentatively, she began to thaw. She started helping Miriam in the garden, her small hands gentle with the new seedlings. She would sit on the porch and listen as Eli told the children stories of the land, his voice low and steady. One evening, Eli found her by the cottonwood tree where Catherine was buried. She was just standing there looking at the simple wooden cross. "That was his first wife," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Eli said, standing beside her. "Did you love her?" "Very much," he said. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Ruth asked, "Do you love my mother?" Eli looked at the cabin where he could see Miriam through the window, humming as she set the table for dinner. He could see Calb and Anna chasing fireflies in the yard. His heart swelled with a feeling he thought had been buried with Catherine. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I do." Ruth seemed to consider this. Then she reached out and for the first time slipped her small, hesitant hand into his. That summer, under the shade of that same cottonwood tree, Eli and Miriam were married. The sheriff, Cade, now a changed and humbled man, stood as Eli's witness. The children stood beside them, Calb, proud and straight, Anna throwing flower petals, and Ruth holding her mother's hand, a small, shy smile finally gracing her lips. It wasn't a grand ceremony. There was no fancy dress, no crowd of well-wishers. It was just them, a family forged in the crucible of winter, violence, and loss. That night, Eli sat on the porch, his wife beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. The children were asleep inside, their dreams finally peaceful. The stars were brilliant in the vast, dark sky. He hadn't asked for this life. He had been a man content to live in a tomb of his own making. But love, in its fierce, unexpected way, had broken down the door and dragged him back into the light. He looked at the woman beside him, at the home filled with the sound of children's breathing, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his life hadn't ended with Catherine's death. It had been waiting for the snow to fall, waiting for a desperate mother and her children to appear on a forgotten trail, waiting to begin again. If you were moved by this story of loss, sacrifice, and the incredible power of a second chance, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of the human heart. And let us know in the comments, what do you think is the strongest force in the world?